In this video, I'm going to share exactly how I went from undocumented in the US to a permanent resident in Canada following the study permit pathway. I'll go over the study permit, the post-graduation work permit, and the permanent residency application. For each of these, I'll talk about the eligibility criteria, the documents required, the timeline, and the cost, along with some considerations and lessons learned as someone who went through this process. By the end of this video, you will be aware of this pathway, what it entails, what it requires, and specific insights that you should know as an undocumented person if you choose to pursue this pathway. Everything in this video comes from the IRCC website and my personal knowledge as someone who went through this process. But please remember that I am not a lawyer.
As a person who didn't have DACA in the US, I didn't have any professional work experience I could leverage. So I saw the study permit route or going back to school as my pathway in order to be able to get into Canada. And that is where we start off. One of the very first things you need to know is that a study permit and a visa are not the same thing. They're interlinked and you need both to come to Canada, but it's not a student visa. It's a study permit and it's a visa. Now, what exactly is a study permit? The study permit is a document that Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, issues that allows foreign nationals to study at these institutions. Now, I know one question that you all probably have is, what is a DLI? A designated learning institution, or DLI, is a school that has received approval from their province or territory to host international students. Not all schools in Canada are allowed to take on international students. A really important consideration for undocumented folks who want to consider pursuing this pathway to come to Canada on a study permit, it is really, really important to be aware of certain things. As someone who was undocumented and went through this process, I've learned a few of these things, which I really want to share with you today. The first one being is that, as you are probably aware, once you decide to leave the US, you will most likely trigger some sort of bar. Because you can't go back to the US if things don't work out, you need to be really aware of what you're doing and what the next step is. Here, although the post-graduation work permit might seem like years away, it's something that you have to have in mind now. Not all DLIs will offer programs that are eligible for a post-graduation work permit. We're going to talk more about the permit in the second half of this video, but it is something that you have to be aware of because once you get to that point, you want to move on to the next step, which would be change your status from student to temporary resident as a worker. Now, what is the eligibility criteria to apply for a study permit? So the first one is be enrolled at a DLI. Something that seems like is a very big misconception among the people who reach out to me is that they think that they can just start a study permit process, like submit an application, and that's not the case. After you apply to that school, and after that school admits you, and after they send you that admission letter, that's when you can start applying for a study permit. You can't start this process simultaneously and you can't start it before. You need to go through the process of getting an acceptance letter and then you can start the process. The second one is to prove that you have enough money to pay for your tuition fees and also the living expenses for yourself and any family members are coming with you to Canada, and also having funds to return back home after your permit expires or after you complete your program. You also have to obey the law, so have no criminal record and get a police certificate. Not everyone will have to do this. It really depends on person to person. You also have to be in good health you will prove that through a medical exam. And again, not everyone has to do that. It varies person to person. And the most important one is to prove to an officer that you will return to your home country once your program is over. Now, I know this is probably raising questions like, but technically I kind of want to stay in Canada. Like I want to go and move permanently. So how would I prove that? We're going to get into that. No need to panic. No need to panic, friends. On the screen here, I have the list of required documents that you'll need to submit as part of the study permit application. There's that proof of acceptance, the provincial attestation letter or territorial attestation letter, the proof of identity, and the proof of financial support. Some people will be required to submit additional documents, and among these could be the letter of explanation, which is actually not optional, friends. We'll get into that in a bit. A medical exam, a custodial declaration if you're a minor, and other potential documents. The very first thing that you're going to need is that acceptance letter. That letter of acceptance is what qualifies as your proof of acceptance. In 2024, the Canadian government started implementing a cap on international student numbers to control immigration and the housing crisis. So, all provinces and territories of Canada are now allocating the number of international students they can accommodate by their federal or provincial government. This attestation letter provides evidence that, as a student, you've been accounted within these caps. This letter also serves as a confirmation that you'll be studying at the college or university. The method for obtaining it varies slightly province and territory to province to territory, but generally speaking, after you get your admission letter, you confirm that you're attending the university by paying a deposit, and after paying that deposit, you usually get that attestation letter through your university itself. As part of your proof of identity, you'll have to submit two things: your passport, and that is a photocopy of the information page, and also all the pages that have stamps or visas on them, and also two recent passport size photos that you'll have to include your name and your birthday on the back of. If your study permit is approved, you'll have to go through the process of mailing your passport to the office they indicate to get that visa placed in your passport. Now, I want to address something that's really, really important and that has some undocumented folks who want to apply for the study permit a little concerned. So, since April of 2022, permanent residents and anyone coming to Canada from the United States can be asked, or at least they're required, to show that they have some sort of legal legal status or legal residence within the United States. So when you get to the port of entry, you could be asked to show that proof. Showing that you have some sort of legal status in the US is not part of the application, but it is something that could be asked of you at the port of entry. And I know this is something like, oh, well, how do you get around this? Well, I can't guarantee anything, and this goes is part of a larger conversation that you need to have with yourself in terms of your risk tolerance, because there is inherent risk in pursuing this pathway because it is immigration related, and undocumented folks have no legal status in the U.S. But I do want to share that for me, showing my status was not something that was asked. And also, of all the people that I've spoken to who have come to Canada recently who were undocumented in the US, they were also not asked to show this proof. So, more likely than not, you probably won't be asked to show the proof of status in the US. But it's important to know that it is on the website and it is possible that it is asked. And I want to be transparent with all of you in sharing that information. As part of the other documents that you may need to include as part of your application, I really want to focus on the letter of explanation. So, generally speaking, the letter of explanation is a letter that you write that helps the visa officer understand you and your goals and understand more of why you want to come to Canada and see that you understand your responsibilities as a student. Now, this part is critical. I can't emphasize that enough, especially for undocumented folks. I mean, for everyone, but especially for undocumented folks, because when you submit this application, you are, you should not, I should say that, you should not, never try to like hide or not say that you're undocumented. Just, you need to be upfront about it. And this is where you're upfront about it. So, and this is the part where you really have to sell your story within a page, a very concise page. You have to say, you have to convey that your intention is not to become undocumented in Canada. That you're not using the study permit route to come here and then become undocumented if you lose status or just to get in. There's been a lot of problems regarding people coming to Canada and then not even going to the school and then just living here as undocumented, and it's become a really big problem. But aside from all of that, if you're undocumented in the US and you're watching this and you're trying to come here, why would you ever want to be undocumented again? That's, I mean, to each their own, but friends, don't do it. If you're pursuing this pathway, have the end goal in mind. Have that status, because you deserve to live with that happiness and freedom that come with the status. So you really need to be aware of these things. And as part of this explanation, and this could be its own video on its own, you really have to get into how you came to be undocumented, why why you couldn't gain a status while you were there. Also, that you understand that you can't stay here if you once you graduate and if you don't pursue, the next step. And also convey that you have enough ties to your home country to really convey that you're not going to stay here. Because when you're submitting the study permit application, even if you want to, come here and stay as a permanent resident one day, that's not the tone or not the voice or not the message that you're conveying in this letter. In this letter, you're literally saying, I want to come to Canada to get this quality education and then take that quality education back to my home country and help my home economy grow or help the field that I'm studying grow back at home. And that could be the case. If things didn't work out for me here in Canada, that is exactly what I wanted to do and take this great education and apply it to help Mexico. But when you're writing this letter, the focus and the purpose is to say you're going to come to school, you're going to do your time, and then you're going to go home, not to stay. The other thing you could need is that medical exam. Now, some it will vary person to person. You might or might not need it. When I submitted my application, a medical exam was not part of something I had to do. That's something I didn't have to do until later for permanent residency. But you could. Now, for a medical exam, you can't just go to any doctor. There'll be instructions if you are required to do it, but you have to go to a pre-selected panel physician from a specific list. You can't go to anyone. And this part can get expensive. It could be in the no, it's in the hundreds of dollars to get this exam. So this is one of those indirect costs that we'll get into later. If you're a minor and you're coming to Canada, you need to have a custodial declaration, meaning that your parents signed this document and your custodian here in Canada signed this document saying that, they're aware and they know that this person is going to be taking care of you. And well, you want to make sure that minors are taken care of. So that only applies if you're underage. And then there could be others. When you think about timelines, it's hard to quantify how long it will take you because it varies person to person. The process of applying to schools can be as long or short as you have the time and commitment to put into it. Now, the process from receiving that acceptance letter to submitting your study permit to getting a decision approval or denial. Now, that's something that has a timeline. The processing times are always available on the website, and I will make sure to link all these websites in the description box. But you can anticipate it taking 10 to 12 weeks. So if you're someone who hears back from a school in May, you really need to be quick with this turnaround time and submitting the application in order to start on time in the fall semester. That 10 to 12-week period also does not include the time to provide your biometrics. After you submit your study permit application, you'll get a letter from IRCC being like, we received your application, but in order to continue, you need to send us your biometrics. Friends, this is another part of the application that has inherent risk for undocumented folks. After you submit your application and you get that letter requesting your biometrics, you're going to have to visit either a United States Citizenship and Immigration Services or a visa application center. Now, a lot of people who have gone through this process have reached out and asked me, well, how did you do it? Because technically speaking, when you go to these buildings, you should have a legal status in the US. You could be asked to present that identification, or could be questioned as to why you don't have that identification. And that's something that unfortunately I can't reassure you that, oh, you're going to be completely fine. That's a risk. And again, you have to assess your risk tolerance and the risk you're willing to take to pursue this opportunity. But once again, I'm only going to tell you about me and what I've heard from other people who are undocumented who pursued this opportunity and had to go through this. When I went to this center, because I had that official letter from Canada asking to provide these biometrics, I made an appointment. I walked to the office. I waited for my appointment for my turn. I walk up to the lady. I showed the lady. She scanned it. She checked my identification, which was my Mexican passport. She took my pictures, took my fingerprints, and then sent me on my way. There was minimal interaction between us. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't ask for anything else. It was quick. But going to that appointment was terrifying for me. I was honestly so scared of what was going to happen to me in that building, but nothing happened. From other people that I've gone through this process, from what I've heard from them, same thing. They went there really afraid of what might happen, but they did their thing, provided their biometrics, and then went on their way. With that said, again, I can't guarantee anything of what might happen at these centers or what questions you'll be asked. I'm just sharing what I face, and I want to make you well aware that this is another area that this process might get a little tricky. Now that we're talking about the cost, I want to be really upfront about the real true cost of this by covering both the direct and indirect, because I could tell you that, the study permit costs X and, that was it. But that I feel like that doesn't convey the full story of the financial commitment that this process takes. So for direct costs, the study permit application does I can't talk anymore. Does cost 150 Canadian dollars, and the visitor visa is 100 Canadian dollars. When you apply for a study permit, you're going to be issued your visa as part of that application, so you don't have to apply for it separately. In that same checklist where you'll be told what documents you need to submit, there'll be the documents for both items. So you don't have to worry about this being a second process. For the indirect costs, this could be a wide range of things, but to start off, it could be those application fees to universities. Every time you apply to a university, there's going to be a fee that they charge to even review your application, whether they accept it or not. And that could get pricey if you apply to a lot of schools. There's also that police certificate. So this is through the FBI, called an identity history summary request. And it's not very expensive, but it does cost money. The medical exam can get really pricey, and that's something also that is not directly factored in, but you need it in order to submit an application. There's also that passport renewal if you need to renew your passport. There's also those photos that are asked, and I like to consider the transportation cost. Going to places to get these documents does cost gas money. It does cost bus fare. It's not cheap. So all of these things keep in mind, because it is not just about the study permit application fee. It's about all these other things too. What happens after graduation? So you went through the process of applying to schools, you got that approval, you submitted that permit, the permit was approved, you came to Canada, you did your program. What happens next? Like, what's the next step? It's important for you to know that once you complete your program on a Canadian study permit, you have 90 days, and after those 90 days, your permit becomes invalid. And if you are no longer an international student on a study permit, you don't have status. You lose your status, which then makes you undocumented. And you don't want to be undocumented. We don't want that for you anymore. We're beyond those undocumented days if you decide to come to Canada. Never again. So at that point, you have one of two options. You can either apply to stay in Canada longer through the post graduation work permit and eventually follow that pathway to become a temporary resident and permanent resident, or you could just go back home. Those are both options. Something that I really like about Canada is this post graduation work permit. The post graduation work permit is a type of work permit that is only available to international students who completed their education here in Canada. It is not something you can apply for if you didn't study here. The other really cool thing about this permit is that while it's being processed, you have implied status, so you can continue working while you wait for a decision. And another really cool thing about this post graduation work permit is that it's an open work permit, meaning it's not tied to a specific employer. You could technically apply for it and be unemployed. You could be on this permit and then change jobs 5 times. It's not tied to an employer, which is really, really, really awesome. I'm bringing this slide up again because I think it's really, really, really important that you begin to see those connections as to why it's really important to be aware of things from the very beginning. So, as you recall, I did mention that it's important for you to check if your DLI has programs that are eligible for a post graduation work permit. Because, say you didn't check that and you graduated thinking you were all good, and then you got here and realized your program isn't eligible, or worse yet, you submitted an application only to find out you got rejected because the school wasn't eligible for a post graduation work permit, you'd be in a very tricky situation. General eligibility requirements for a post graduation work permit include having completed a study program at a DLI, maintained full time status, applied for this permit within 180 days after you graduate, and have your study permit valid during the 180 days after you graduated. Starting on November of last year, post graduation work permit applicants are now required to submit proof of language skills. This means that even if you are a fluent English speaker or did your program in English, you'll still have to prove that you have to prove your proficiency level in this language, and in French if you choose to show that one as well. Outside of Quebec, you also have to make sure that your program was at least 8 months in length. It can't be shorter than that, or you're not eligible for the permit. As part of your post graduation work permit application, you'll have to submit proof that you completed your studies, proof that you were enrolled in full time studies for a program that was at least 8 months or longer, the proof of language ability through one of the tests that were mentioned in the last slide, Proof that you completed your studies can be your degree or diploma, an official letter from your school, or an official transcript or copy of your transcript from your school's website. For proof that you were enrolled in full-time studies, this is either an official transcript issued by your DLI or a copy of your official transcript from your DLI's website. As you're beginning to see, you can use one thing that satisfies multiple criteria. For the proof of language, you need to show that you have a certain level of understanding under the reading, writing, listening, and speaking criteria. You also have to make sure that this is a recent test, so it can't be too outdated. Now, talking about the timeline and other considerations, submitting an application can happen as soon as your institution designates you as degrees awarded. So that doesn't necessarily mean graduation. That could happen a little bit before, or a little bit after. You just need to be very proactive and keep track of your student portal and see when this happens. Depending on how fast you can retrieve all your documents is how fast you can submit this application. The post-graduation work permit processing time varies, but usually you can anticipate about 120 days. Like I mentioned earlier, during this time, you can continue to work under implied status. But it's really, really important to know that from the moment you are degrees awarded to the moment you submit your application, so that little few days in between, you can't work. So you can't work during those few days, but you can work as soon as you submit that application. For the direct and indirect costs, the direct cost, the work permit was 155 Canadian dollars and the open work permit holder fee was 100 Canadian dollars. For indirect costs, for the post-graduation work permit, there really wasn't much. There's just maybe some cost to request an official document from the university and others. This will vary person by person. So you completed your educational program, you applied for the post-graduation work permit, your post-graduation work permit was approved, and you started working. Now what? If you studied in Canada and you've gained some of that Canadian work experience, there are now pathways that you can pursue to permanent residency. On the screen here, I have a few immigration programs currently available. So there's the Atlantic Immigration Program, Canadian Experience Class, Federal Skilled Trades Program, Federal Skilled Worker Program, the Provincial Nominee Program, and the Rural Northern Immigration Pilot. It's really important to note that immigration changes happen very, very often in Canada. So it's really important to stay up to date by visiting the IRCC website. New programs are continuously released to address the nation's unique labor, economic, and demographic needs. This year, IRCC has already announced two new programs, the Rural Community Immigration Pilot and the Francophone Community Immigration Pilots. They are not yet open, but they have been announced that they will be opening in the near future. We went through the study permit process. We talked about the post-graduation work permit. Now we're going to get into express entry, specifically the Canadian Experience class, which is how I became a permanent resident. To make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to begin by explaining a little bit of what express entry is at a high level. So express entry is an online system that the government of Canada uses to manage immigration applications for their skilled workers. There are three programs that are managed through express entry. There's the Canadian Experience class, the Federal Skilled Workers Program, and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. In order to create an express entry profile, you do answer a few questions that are based on the comprehensive ranking system. Now, this is a points-based system that Canada uses to score your profile and rank it in the pool. So everybody who's in this pool who wants to become a permanent resident has a score. And every so often, Canada chooses their top candidates to invite for permanent residency, invite to apply for permanent residency. When you're as part of your comprehensive ranking system score, you're assessed on your skills, your education, your language ability, your work experience, and other factors. The maximum score you can have is 1,200 points. And this is based on core and human capital factors, spouse or common law partner factors, if applicable, the skill transferability factors, and additional points. The bulk of your points are going to come from the core human capital factors. This is based off your age, your level of education, your official language proficiency, and your Canadian work experience. The max score you can get for this is 460 for yourself and 500 if you have a spouse or common law partner. When talking about the age, the maximum points are given to people ages 20 to 29, and that is 100 points. After 29, every year after 29, you lose 5 points. So by the time you're 45, you earn 0 points for your age. For education, as you probably imagine, the higher education, the higher the score. For language, the max score you could get is 128 or 136, depends if your spouse is included in this application or not, for your first language, and 24 or 22 for your second language. Something that I forgot to mention earlier is that in the US, when someone says bilingual, people automatically think of Spanish and English because of the big Latino population. But in Canada, that's not the case. Bilingualism in Canada refers to English and French. So speaking Spanish, I don't know how to say this. It really doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't help you in any way. The only language that will help you is if you learn French. So for purposes of this application, when we're referring to the second language is French. There is no other language that matters for this context. English and French only. With the work experience, 1 year of Canadian work experience gives you 40 points, and 5 years or more gives you 80 points. So in between, you just gradually accumulate more points for that Canadian work experience. After you create your profile and you have your CRS score, the candidates that have the highest CRS score are then invited in rounds. Not everyone that's in the pool will receive an invitation to apply. Unfortunately, that's hard to hear, but that's the truth. There's so many people who are still waiting to this day to become permanent residents, and it's due to their comprehensive ranking system score not being high enough. If you receive an invitation to apply, then you then complete the application. That application gets reviewed, and then you either become a permanent resident or you don't. Since the whole purpose of this video was to walk you through exactly how I became a permanent resident, I'm going to shift it back over to me now. I qualified for two different streams through Express Entry. So I was eligible for the Federal Skilled Worker Program and the Canadian Experience class stream. But I received my invitation to apply through the Canadian Experience class. On the screen here, I have my comprehensive ranking system score breakdown for each of the categories. As you can see, the human capital are the bulk of my points. For my age, because I'm in my 20s, I got 110 points. My level of education gave me 135. My first official language was English, gave me 133. And 1 year of Canadian work experience gave me 40. From there, my US education, gave me another 50 points. And then that Canadian education, which the master's I did here, gave me an additional 30 points, all adding up to 498. I received an invitation to apply through the December 8th round of invitations. On the screen here, there is more information about that round. So there was 5,900 people who were invited to apply in this round. The lowest person who was invited had a score of 481. Because it's really, really important for undocumented folks to be aware of what it's the reality of becoming a permanent resident and never trying to portray it as an easy, it's for sure going to happen type of thing. I want to show you the round of invitations before I was invited. As you can see here, for the general categories, the scores were in the 500s. I was very, very lucky that I received an invitation to apply because of the STEM occupation straw. If there was no STEM occupation straw, I would probably be still in the pool right now, a year later, because my score was really not competitive. It was under 500. Those round of invitations were in the fall of 2023. That's outdated information. This on the screen here is recent rounds of information, and I really want you to notice that there is an influence as to who or what groups get an invitation to apply based on the needs of the country. So here you can see that of all the express entry categories, the majority that received an invitation since November of last year have been through Canadian Experience class. The also thing I want you to notice is how many more provincial nominee program people have received this invitation to apply. Provincial nominee programs vary province to province, but provinces have their own different pathways and different criteria based on their needs on who they can invite to apply for permanent residency. So it's separate from express entry. As you can see here, the scores for those Canadian Experience class people are in the 500s. We have a 521, a 527, a 542, and a 539. Nowhere on these are there any 400 score people. It's because it's become very competitive to receive an invitation to apply. So it's so important to really try to get as many points as possible for your profile. When we bring it back to timelines, no two paths are the same. And I talk about this all the time. If you get nothing else from this video today, it's that becoming a permanent resident is not a guarantee, and becoming a permanent resident is not easy, especially not today. The process that I faced when I came to Canada to the process someone would face coming now are very different. It has gotten a lot harder. Many factors are going to influence how fast you receive it in ITA. There is already so much variability within the CRS score. There's also the changing economic, demographic, and labor needs of Canada. There's also your awareness of this immigration and change in landscape. If I'm being completely candid here, I probably could have become a permanent resident faster if I had been aware of a few things. Or I could have, if it weren't for the STEM draw, I could still be waiting in the pool now. So there's just so much change, so many variables, so many things within your control and outside of your control that you really have to try to stay aware of everything and build yourself up so you can stand the best possible chance. If I had to redo this all over and I had not been invited to apply for permanent residency already, an action item or an action step that I would be taking today is working on my French proficiency, because that is an area that I could feasibly build up to build a more competitive profile. Bringing this back to my own timeline, I received my post-graduation work permit in January of 2023. In December of 2023, I received an invitation to apply. I submitted that in January of 2024, and in May, I became a Canadian permanent resident. Of all the immigration steps I took, the permanent residency was by far the most expensive. The processing fee for the permanent residency application was 950 Canadian dollars, and the right of permanent residency fee was $575, both of which added up to $1,525. This also had a lot more indirect costs. So there was that police certificate that I had to get from the FBI in the US. There was the upfront medical exam, which was expensive. There was the passport size photos, the biometrics, and the transportation to go retrieve all of these documents. I've walked you through the study permit process, the post-graduation work permit, and the permanent residency, and specifically what I went through, the documents that were required, and also the eligibility criteria. Now I'm going to quickly summarize that and really tie up together all the timelines and then all the costs from start to finish. From the study permit to the permanent residency application, all the application related fees add to 2,030 Canadian dollars. I've said many times throughout social media that in this entire process, I did not use legal representation. I filled out and completed these forms on my own. But I did do a 30-minute consultation with an immigration consultant before submitting my study permit to ask a few specific questions. That 30-minute call was 157 Canadian dollars. So if I combined the legal fees and then the application fees, it adds up to $2,187. The indirect cost is where it gets a little tricky because it varies person to person, and there are so many costs that I probably am not remembering right now that definitely had to be spent in order to submit an application. But there was that police certificate for PR, the upfront medical exam for PR, the passport size photos, which was required for all three applications, the biometrics, which I had to submit for a study permit and PR, and the tuition, of course, because without even going to school here, I would have not been able to go through this entire process. And of course, the scanning and printed, that adds up when there are multiple documents. Without tuition factored in, all of this I would say cost about 500 bucks Canadian. But once I add my tuition, it comes up to $31,350.74 Canadian. So quite a big price tag. The entire process from the day I started my first class to the day I received my permanent residency in total took me 2 years and 8 months, but there were many steps in between. I started classes in September of 2021. I arrived in Canada in January of 2022. I applied for the post-graduation work permit in September of 2022. My post-graduation work permit was approved in January of 2023. I received my invitation to apply in December of 2023. I submitted my PR application in January of 2024. My PR was approved in May of 2024. And wishful thinking and fingers crossed, I will be eligible to apply for citizenship in June of 2026. But I really want to stress again that this, how long it took me, is by no means representative. It really varies person to person.
If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to share it with a friend who you feel will benefit from knowing this information. I post videos every week, and I am always excited to share my journey, share my knowledge, share my insider tips of what I learned and the mistakes I made so you don't have to.